We are now delving into more classic microeconomics. If you remember your class that you took in college, or maybe the prep course for this class, or even as far back as high school, something that you were talking about in that course that you may not have recognized is competition and the degree of competition. So, we start with this premise. A firm can control all of the internal aspects of their company, how they manage their people, how they produce their product, what type of product or services to provide, all of the subset functions like accounting and finance and human resources, they have control over those things. It does not have control over their actual outcome. They don't have absolute control whether they make a profit or whether their market share actually grows. All of their efforts are obviously towards gaining profit and gaining market share, but those outcomes are not in the hands of the managers. So, what can a firm do to gain control over that? Well, it can change internal functions by seeking efficiencies, by seeking cost reductions. It can do whatever it possibly can to shape that external environment so that it does at least feel like it has mitigated some of the risk that it cannot control. One piece that they then obviously do not have control over is how other firms behave. So let's get into the basics of these microeconomics. So we're talking about competition here. And so we also need to say, well, what is competition? This is when we have two organizations that are competing for the same result, and they're doing it similarly. If one company makes a decision and it adversely impacts another, we have started to see our first sign of some force of competition. If we see a firm slash a price and it causes a reduction in revenue of another firm, again, another example of how these firms do face some form of competition. It is not to say that competition is just internal to one market. In fact, we may see lots of markets where firms compete. For the purpose of this paper, though, we are going to be focusing on the actions of three firms that may have some products or services that are the same, mostly the same. So we're trying to focus on the direct competitors. Who are these competitors? Let's think again. We already know something about if one action is taken and it impacts another, we're probably on the path to finding a competitor. Let's think more specifically. The products. If we see close substitutes, this may be a characteristic of an actual competitor. So in the case of a substitute, what we mean is something that basically does exactly the same thing. Okay, so what we're going to see here is a product that may not actually look the same on the outside, right? Marketing efforts are different, advertising in terms of who endorses it are different, but ultimately the product does the same function, similar performance characteristics. You might use the products the same way. They're sold in the same place. These are all giving the sense of what a substitute might be, and hence then figuring out how these companies are rivals or not. Okay, now the degree to which there are these rivals that produce substitutable products then defines the market structure in which these firms find themselves in. Generally, we will characterize the level of competition based upon the degree of concentration. So one end of the spectrum is a monopoly. They have no competition. There is no rival. They are the sole provider of the product, service. They're geographically isolated. Something is limiting the ability for another player to come in and take market share away. On the other side, we have something that could be referred to as perfect competition. This is basically so many players selling almost the exact same product that the only way they can differentiate themselves is through price. The product is, at this point, in this most extreme case, commoditized to the nth degree. Think corn grain. Think something that is so obviously the same from one producer to the next that the only way they might be able to gain any edge in their market is to sell it for a cheaper price. Most likely, we don't see as much of this in the economy today because one simple fact. advertising is very effective. So it puts us somewhere in between. Monopolies are regulated. Monopolies do have circumstances where you can find monopoly power, although um, it is extreme. It is interesting cases, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Okay, let's look at this. Let's look at this chart together here. So here's the spectrum that we can use to identify all of the different types of competition. So there's those two categories: perfect competition, all the way to monopoly. Let's just check out some characteristics. Let's go back to perfect competition. Okay, so in the case of that highly commoditized, undifferentiated product, what we're going to see is that there are a ton of producers and there are a ton of buyers, in which case this is very purely competitive. People are competing upon the value claim, the price. The product is almost identical. That means that a company couldn't say, hey, look, this characteristic does this, and hence you need to pay more for it. The product is so obviously the same from one seller to the next that the only way that a person could have an edge is if they sold it for a cheaper price. What does it take to get into this industry that's highly competitive? It's pretty easy. Anybody can start it, anybody can do it. Equipment's cheap, equipment can be sold if you don't do well. All the things that are needed to start are fairly simple, right? So it makes it very easy for new players to come in and again produce more of this product. Does a firm have influence over price? In the most extreme case, in the most idealistic sense of perfect competition, no. It is the purely market solution. In reality, all firms do have some control over price, and they're going to do whatever they possibly can to get at least a fraction of a profit margin. Even if it's very little, generally firms are not seeking to break even. So look at our examples here. Agricultural crops, grains, things that you just kind of don't associate with very effective marketing campaigns. Does the slogan "Got Milk" really make a difference to how many gallons of milk you buy per week? Okay, what's something a little bit closer to the world that we live in? Monopolistic competition. So notice that we have a characteristics of monopolistic in here, meaning they have control over something, but it's also highly competitive. This is more of the world that we see around us. This is many firms, but they differentiate their product. They make a claim that it is somehow different from one producer to the next. Whether it could be an ad, it could be somebody saying they like the product better than another or service. It is something that tells the buyer that they should pay more for this than the next person who sells it. So there's something differentiated. And in the case of this market structure, when consumers start to say, hey, I'm going to buy this from you, they now have a monopoly over a subset of the marketplace. So those people keep going back. I like to think this: where do you buy your gas? I bet you're a QT person. If not, ask yourself why. But for all those QT people that do say yes, ask yourself why. Something makes you keep going back. So QT has a little bit of monopoly over your purchasing decision. Is it easy to get into this industry? It can be fairly easy. Basically, how you produce the thing is fairly commoditized and standard. And if you were to fail, you could sell your equipment. It's not that highly specialized. You do have some power over price. Now we enter the component. These are the example given here: chicken, beef, and pork. Okay, so let's think how. Those sound like they're pretty standard products, but now we start to see grades of meat. We start to see the claim of organic, non-organic. We start to see things like farm fresh. We start to see all of those differentiating characteristics that say you should buy from this company and not this company. Okay, now while many small businesses exist in this monopolistically competitive environment, generally the economy in post-industrial worlds has moved to oligopolistic structures. These are our large corporations. These are the companies with hundreds of brands. These are the companies that have so much money that they can fail in one area and have another component of their business be their extreme profitable position. So there's going to be a few of these sellers. Think these are the big producers: Procter and Gamble, General Motors, companies that are huge and have a lot of capital. They have so much ability to mess around that they can produce identical products or they can produce differentiated products. So they can be in lots of different markets at the same time. And it is extremely hard to try to think you could ever compete with them. Let's say you want to just start competing with Disney tomorrow. Do you think it's possible? Probably not. No. Let's see. Do they have any control over price? Yeah, definitely. In some cases, they exercise their ability to price up, and in some cases, they don't, just to maintain a market. And they may even actually take losses on certain products simply to maintain that position and outcompete. Uh, Dairy. Yes, there's few providers here. So that's what you're trying to think here. Few providers. Okay, last extreme. One company, one product, one service, one seller. That's what we're talking about here. It could be a unique product. Now, you could have geographic differentiation here too. Like, say you're a hospital in a rural area. You do enjoy some monopoly status, but these are unique situations. Very difficult to then compete. So even though you may enjoy monopoly power in the short term, it may not be something that you can hang on to. You have substantial ability to raise your price to the highest profit margin possible, although you're limited to the expectation of the consumer. You obviously can't go to the point where people couldn't afford it. In a regulated example, we have electricity, gas companies. These are called natural monopolies, and they're regulated monopolies. Although you can find monopoly power in the case of geographic isolation or a new product that's come to the market and there's a first mover status. When you look at the main PowerPoint, the longer PowerPoint, and you also look at the chapter associated with market characteristics, I think you'll get a better sense of how these four different market structures are constructed, and also how you will need to designate your strategic group. So for your first assignment, these are the questions that you're going to be asking and thinking about your three firms. Okay, so what are key forces shaping competition? Is it easy to make a profit in this industry? Are you noticing very specific actions that the companies in the industry or your group are taking to insulate themselves from these competitive forces? Are they selling a unique product or are they selling something that is highly commodified? What could be some substitutes for the product? Let's see, is geography a factor into defining this market? So kind of that isolation characteristic I was discussing. These are the kind of questions that you'll need to ask and answer for next week's assignment. So take a look at this and take a look at the handout that I've posted. Your assignment due date is set, and provide an outline to these questions and make a designated market structure characteristic or definition